Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Emma Harcourt is a Sydney-based writer who works as a researcher and journalist as well as an author. After completing the Faber Academy course in 2011, Emma began writing historical fiction. The result was 2 novels, the first being the critically acclaimed international best-selling title, The Shanghai Wife, published in 2018, and now The Brightest Star, released earlier this year by HQ Fiction. Whilst I have to confess, listeners, I haven't read The Shanghai Wife yet, I was utterly enthralled by Luna's story in The Brightest Star. As a fan of historical fiction in general, this book was a page-turning read, giving its audience insight into the plight of women in Renaissance Florence, which sadly still echoes in parts of the world today. And I'm delighted to have the chance to speak with Emma about the book in more detail on the podcast. Welcome, Emma.
Oh, thank you so much, Claudine. It is just lovely to be here with you talking Aussie books.
So wonderful to have you. Now, The Brightest Star, such a clever book, Emma. Congratulations. How are you feeling about it?
Thank you. Look, I am so excited that it is out in the world, kind of relieved and also just filled with that nervous trepidation of, the fact that it is out in the world and it's no longer something I can keep working on in the privacy and reassurance of my own home. Now I've had to sort of send my book baby out into the world. So I'm thrilled. And I think as my second book, having, you get a debut out there and then you have to, I want to write another one, but it comes with all of that expectation and pressure that you put on yourself because now you're a published author. So to have got over that and to be able to say that I've had 2 books published just is a really wonderful thing. And I feel very lucky and fortunate to be a published author in Australia at the moment, actually.
Emma, can you tell me what sparked your desire to write about a young woman in 15th century Italy? Was Luna's story based on a real historical figure?
Look, I love Italy. I've always loved Italy. I spent some time in Florence when I finished high school, so I had this connection to my own younger self when I was just growing up and becoming an adult, and I just had the most fantastic time. Like I turned 19 in Florence in the late 1980s. I was studying Italian language and I met all these amazing people, and it's just such a beautiful, beautiful city. And when I was thinking about what to write for my second book, I wanted to set it in Italy, in Florence. But the actual story of Luna is completely fictionalized, except that when I started to look into that period of time, the Renaissance, and I started to do some research, I came across a small group of extraordinary women of the day who were actually really intelligent and were writing and debating and speaking in public, but were struggling as individuals, and as women were not given any opportunity to pursue that once they'd hit the age of puberty and when they were expected to get married. The more I read about it, and the more I was completely shocked that I didn't know anything about any of these people. I'd never heard about these women. And obviously, I'm not a historian expert in the Renaissance Florence, hopefully a bit more so now that I've written the book about it. But at the time, I was like, how on earth did these poor women survive, and what extraordinary forgotten stories theirs are? So that's where it began.
So for readers out there who haven't read The Brightest Star yet, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about the story.
Sure. So the book is set in Florence in the late 1400s when the religious leader Savonarola was the strongest political force in Florence. It was the Medicis had been exiled. So it was this really small window when the city was held sort of in a religious lockdown. The bonfire of the Vanities happened around this time. And my main character, Leonardo Lunetta, who is called Luna for short, is this really feisty young woman who is intelligent and curious and has a close relationship with her father and wants to be an astronomer. So she loves the stars. She loves going stargazing with her father at night. And she wants to learn more about that. And her father has educated her as a young girl, as some of the humanists did at the time. And so she's got all this information in her head and she's really excited to pursue it further. and has every expectation that she'll be allowed to do that because her father has been so accommodating up until that point. But of course, at that time, women really only had two choices, which was to marry or to join a convent. And so Luna's journey is about coming up against those brick walls, having to reassess what she thinks about her family and her relationship with her father, what that means for her as a young woman in Renaissance Italy at that time, and personally how she manages herself and what her journey is to get through that, and her sort of coming of age. So it's sort of there's a bit of romance. She comes across some people who are real historical figures, but I've sort of fictionalized their involvement in the story. It's a story about a father and daughter's relationship, and it's just set in this really rich time of Italian history, the Renaissance, when there was so much wonderful art and culture and really vibrant material for me to deal with as a historical fiction author.
I think, as I said, before we started recording, it is such a multi-layered, such a rich fabric that you've woven for us readers. It's just an incredible, there's so much going on in there, and you just drop names like Botticelli and Michelangelo, the Medicis, and all those wonderful places in Florence that I remember as a 19-year-old traveling, all those wonderful places that you just, you'd only ever heard about or read about in books, and suddenly it comes alive for you on the page. It's of this story.
I've got to say, it's so much fun sitting there thinking you can drop a name in like Botticelli. I mean, come on, you're sitting in Sydney in 2020, writing a book, and yet your head is in the land of those sorts of artists and things. Was so much fun, but also this huge sense of responsibility, because it's like they are real people. So you have to make sure you get it right, and you get the historical accuracy there without it being kind of heavy-handed, so the reader still feels like I always think, the reader wants to time travel effectively and be dropped into that day and that place and feel and smell the smells of the streets of Florence. So, creating that is one side of the historical fiction responsibility. And the other one is, because it is history, it's not fantasy, it's making it feel authentic as well. But I love all of that. And being able to work with such wonderful names and characters from that period was really fantastic.
Okay, so the tagline for this book is, "It's a dangerous time to be a clever woman." Emma, can you tell me more about that and how this informed the story and why you wanted to explore that theme in the context of this book?
Sure. It's a great question. Thank you. It's a dangerous time to be a clever woman really talks to a number of the themes in the book. The broad one is that during the Renaissance period, we think of the Renaissance as this time of enlightenment and cultural awakenings. And certainly, the humanists, they did start to educate their daughters as well as their sons. But it really was a two-edged sword for the young women, because once they hit maturity at marriageable age, which at that time was 13, 14, and frankly, they'd already been betrothed oftentimes since they were 6 years old. I mean, I have daughters, and the thought is just diabolical. So, they were educated alongside their brothers. They learnt to read, to write. They were taught religious studies, the more gentle of the subjects, but nevertheless, they were kind of introduced to the possibility of their own voice and their own minds. And then once they hit marriageable age, all of that disappeared, and they basically had no options at all, and they had no voice. And I came across these few women, one of whom Luna talks about in the book is Otta Nogarola, who was alive in like the decades before the book is written. And she was a Veronese from Verona, and she was a really bright young woman, and she was educated, she debated. The sort of the equivalent of having intellectual conversations was writing letters, and she did that, and she was accepted, and her father allowed her to do that, and she was sort of lauded as this intelligent woman, intelligent girl actually, because she was still a child. When she hit the marriageable age, she asked if she could continue to be educated and to continue in academia. And she was completely pilloried for it, to the point where they started rumours that she was having an incestuous affair with her brother. It completely demolished any standing that she had. all she'd done is start to put the suggestion out there that she become, that she continued to converse with these men, and they immediately, pilloried her as a immoral woman, that it was all after sexual gratification. So basically she said, well, I still don't want to get married. So she became a nun. And whilst that gave her the ability, once she'd had a number of years in the convent, she was then reintroduced and allowed to re-enter all of those male areas of society because she was married to God, to Christ. And so suddenly, as a virgin married to Christ, she had standing and authority again. She was no longer a sexual threat to these men, and she was allowed to continue to read books and learn. But she spent the rest of her life in and she called it a book-lined cell in total isolation. So her choices was that in order to still be able to use her mind, she had to remove herself completely from society. And so that's why it was a dangerous time to be a clever woman, specifically in the late 1490s when my book's written, when Savonarola was in power. He was also clamping down on everything from the colours of the clothes that women could wear, any sort of adornments they had on. The bonfire of the vanities was not only burning books, but it was burning works of art. It was burning gold candelabra. It was burning the wigs that they wore, the rouges that the women wore. It was all considered similarly to be, symbols of sexualization and impropriety amongst women. So poor old women of the time really had no options. And if you had a voice, if you wanted to have a voice, it was an impossibility and you would be sent to a convent. So that's really where that tagline came from. The reason I wanted to write about it, and what became more apparent as I was writing the book, was that even though so much has changed for us over these centuries, there's still, sadly, some of it still hasn't changed. The Taliban taking back over in Afghanistan happened during the writing of this book. I looked at women being forced out of universities, education being stopped, the abortion debate in the United States. Whichever way you fall in that debate, it was still about a woman's right to control her choices with her own body. And I had these horrible moments of realizing that there was so much resonance and still so much that we deal with today, that a dangerous time to be a clever woman, you could apply that to certain places in the world today as well.
Emma, I find that so much women's writing these days touches on this very sore point, that women, not only throughout history, but even today, are punished for things that are beyond their control. So, for example, in this story, Julia, Luna's birth mother, thought that she would be outcast by her husband or Florentine society for giving birth to a child with a deformity. Luna herself, whilst spared the weight of societal expectations to marry because of that same deformity, was shunned by society, deemed little more than the devil's spawn or an embarrassment to her father and family because she dared to speak her mind or show that she had intellect and could converse on things that were deemed only suitable for men at the time. Can you speak to me a little bit more about that?
Look, I suppose I haven't mentioned Luna's misshapen foot, which is she's born with that, because for me that's not who she is.
Yeah.
But at the time that was very much what defined her, and I guess I was upping the ante for her in terms of the challenges that she faced. But yes, the very first chapter of the book is her birth scene, and her birth mother Julia would have been blamed for what had happened to her, with the full expectation that her husband would cast her out, that she was the reason why the baby was not perfect, and perfection was something back then which was pretty essential in terms of your family. And then Luna goes on through her life with a limp, and she wears a boot that's fashioned to sort of stabilize her and give her feet an even walking pattern, and she has a walking stick. And all of that was considered, that really was enormous judgment for her around that in society. But what that gave her was a resilience, and I think her personality that just said, well, I'm not going to let this beat me down. And she lent on her father for a lot of that. So, there's this really complicated relationship with her father, which is also born out of her dependency on him and her support of him for that, because it's the dad who came in, Vincenzio, who came in and said, well, actually, you're not, the mother, I don't think there's any spoilers, that, the mother wants to get rid of the baby, and Vincenzio is like, well, no, that's a fugitive, that's my family, so we won't do that. So it's kind of a complicated relationship. But yeah, God, that poor mother, birth mother, not only are you giving birth under horrendous circumstances, and she birthed a girl child, which A is, lesser than an heir, and then she was born with a malformed foot, she would have been terrified. Sadly, that's the way of the day. I mean, there was an orphanage in Florence that opened, the first one, and it was for abandoned girl babies, because they would do that. Babies who weren't born with any challenges, simply for being born a girl. So yeah, it was a pretty horrendous time. And yet, we don't think about that stuff when we think about the Renaissance, I don't think, because it's that word has all this associations with beauty
and enlightenment.
And enlightenment, indeed. I know, right? It's ironic.
It's paradoxical.
It sure is. It sure is. But you know what? I guess they could equally, people can look back on our time and we all think we've come leaps and bounds. And yet, maybe in another 200 years, people are going to write about us and find the same paradoxes.
You've talked a little bit about this before, but not only did you choose to set this book in Renaissance Florence, but you grounded the novel in a politically dangerous time. As you said, the Medicis had been banished from Florence and anyone who was associated with them were in mortal peril, but also at a time where there seemed to be challenges to accepted thinking around astronomy and the universe. To that end, you mentioned work by the ancient Greeks and also Copernicus, who himself features in the book. Can you tell me more about this and why was it important to Luna's story?
Oh my gosh. So, I mean, I just love the astronomy, but I have to say I had no idea how much work I would have to do. Far out. Like when I started with this idea for the book, initially I was like, well, maybe I'll make her a mathematician. And I was like, Emma, there's just no way you can write about a maths genius with any authority. And foolishly, I went, yeah, but I love the stars. I love, constellations. Oh, let's go with astronomy. Oh my gosh. It was a lot of work, a lot of really wonderful work, because I love learning as I write as well. I love Sudoku and crosswords and all of that sort of stuff. And it's like finding, it's like sorting out a puzzle, finding all the pieces to a puzzle. Yes. So the astronomy just seemed to fit so perfectly with the challenges that I wanted Luna to face. When the book is written, they think that the Earth is stationary at the center of the universe, and the sun and the planets that they knew about revolved around the Earth. It was written in the Bible, and to say anything against that was heresy. Galileo wasn't around yet. He was sort of the first one to really stamp that with any authority. Copernicus was a really young man at the time. And in my research of astronomy, I read about his early years. He did go to Florence and he studied at the university in Bologna. And he witnessed the eclipse of a star, which is called an occult of a star Aldebaran, in the hills of Bologna on a particular night in March. And that is an event that happens in the book down to the month and year. And they say that that's when he was one of the things, the measurements that he took during that eclipse were when he started to think about this radical theory that perhaps the sun was stationary and the Earth, along with the other planets, rotated around the sun. And he put out a really, initially quite a short book about that theory and was completely pilloried and laughed out of the town. And sadly, his heliocentric model wasn't published until after his death. So on his deathbed, his assistant begged him to let it be published. So when Luna's around, Copernicus is a really young man and he's just starting to think about that theory. And I thought, well, how wonderful that was such just a fundamental leap in science and in knowledge. It touched on religion, it touched on astronomy, it gave me the ability to empower Luna with knowledge. And I sort of thought, who's to say there isn't a young woman in 1400s Italy, or women at the time who were intelligent, were considering science, were considering these challenges. We just would never have heard about them. There's no way they would ever have been given a chance to have a voice, or let alone to think in themselves that they had the right to talk about that stuff. And so I decided that I'd create this fictional character, Luna, and give her the ability to influence Copernicus. So really in the story, she meets Copernicus and becomes involved in his work as well, which I just love the idea of making her that person. Yeah.
And so to that end, I began to wonder how, as a writer of historical fiction, how you balance your story with real life historical incidents and people.
Yeah, it's actually really hard. It is a big challenge to be able to make that balance work, but something that's really important for me in writing the historical fiction. So when I finished the first draft of this book, I realized that I didn't really have that balance right, but then that's what a first draft is for, just to get the words out. And so I spent a lot of time looking at the detail of the history to get the accuracy there. What I feel is the stories that I enjoy in historical fiction are those where you get woven into this place where you come across moments when you're like, I know that name. And then you get a version of that paper cutout name as flesh and blood in the book. And I love that. So that's what I wanted to try and give readers. And, you know, I hope I have to a certain extent. And it's also about that creating puzzles, which I love to do. And this period of time had so many fantastic characters, and they gave so much potential for plot development to my book as well. So the religious fundamentalist Girolamo Savonarola enabled me to create this really tense and escalating dark undertones in the book because of his fundamentalism and what he was cracking down on, and how that bumped up against the politics of the day as well with the Medicis. And again, I love finding out about these people. So being able to sort of sprinkle the book with real life characters, I hope gives it an authenticity, and being able to, for me then, to be able to turn those names into real people. I love the opportunity to do that. Copernicus, yes. Even his professor, whose house in Tuscany, sort of a third of the book is set in, that really was Copernicus's professor. That really was the person he studied with in Bologna. So I kind of love that. And it's like finding nuggets of gold when you come across these stories in the history books. And I guess then balancing that out with the fiction side of it is really the main purpose of the book, is to hopefully be a great story and to really pull readers in to Luna's journey, and, you know, just to sit in that world in her world and forget your own for a while. You know, that's the job of fiction for me anyway. You know, that's what I love when I read. That's, for me, is kind of harder than you know, that's the hardest part. And the real life historical figures becoming characters, it's almost like props that make that kind of a bit easier, like for me anyway.
I wondered if your research revealed anything surprising to you. Were there things that you really didn't know, or things that you wanted to include in the book that you weren't able to include in the book?
There's just so much that I could have included. And, you know, I think that's one of the real tricks of a brilliant historical fiction writer, and I'm still learning that stuff, is to not load your book up with the history, you know, to use the bits that really give something more to your story, and not just put it in there because you found out something extraordinary, which, you know, is really hard because there is so much there. And I will go down research rabbit holes for days and days, when really all I needed to find out was whether, you know, Renaissance houses had banisters or anything like that. So when Luna walks up the staircase in her home, I was like, oh, she's got this problem with her foot. She's got a walking stick, but she uses another contraption inside the house. But is there something she can hold on to? You know, I'm like, I had no idea. So then you become an expert on the architecture of Renaissance buildings in that time. And actually, bizarrely, the kitchen was on the top floor, so that if there was, you know, the smoke could disappear, and which I was very surprised by, something like that. I loved the medical bits and pieces that I uncovered. So the bezoar stones that they used, I think in the first chapter, Julia's rubbing one on her tummy to help with the birth. And then further into the book, when there's a snake bite, they use particular unctions which involved dung. They would smear over the wound, thinking that it would help to leach out the snake poison. Those kind of things were really fascinating and cool. You know, generally, I think I was just so shocked when I read about these women and how imprisoned they were in their own worlds, and also how many brilliant women there were. You know, I was shocked that I'd never read the poetry of any of the Renaissance women who I came across, not only as Ottanogarola, but the intelligence of their arguments, which tended to be around religious stuff. Like, I think as Ottanogarola did this great debate, which was a written debate around the sins of Eve, you know, and you just think, gosh, that's just completely forgotten in history. And that was surprising. And I guess that's one of the reasons why I then sort of chose to bring those sorts of people into my novel.
I wanted to talk a little bit about Vincenzo. He was such a contrary character, I think. I love that he wanted to give Luna an education, and to that end, he seemed like a forward-thinking man for his time. But as you said, I think there were a few men who felt it was important to educate their daughters as well as their sons. But in many ways, he was a hypocrite, and his failed businesses gave rise to conflicting actions, particularly where Luna was concerned, didn't it?
Yeah, he's an absolute hypocrite and a really typical man of the time. And frankly, probably the one who was based on other people that I know. Yeah, this side of him that's loving and the father figure and wanting to indulge his daughter. But really, ultimately, it all came down to how it reflected on him. And, Luna's intelligence was only there to reflect his own greatness, because she was only intelligent because he allowed her to be educated. And I found, putting his voice into the book allowed me to really show that side to him and try and understand myself how society operated back there in terms of the patriarchy and in terms of that really oppressive daily lives for women. Yeah, he loves Luna, and yet he cannot get beyond the social mores of the day. He can't get beyond the fact that his own arrogance and his own narcissism and belief that his family and his name and his son will survive and will be the greatest. And I think also there was you get caught up in those days. There was so much pressure around politics, that the life was not private as such. There was a very sense of public responsibility for all men, because they were the only ones who were really given the authority to do that. And he struggled with all of that personally, having to meet the needs of his family as well as the needs of his guild. So he was a wool merchant, and at that time silk had just started to be imported, and so his business was starting to flounder, and he'd built that up himself. So sort of a self-made man, which was one of the great things people say about the Renaissance, is that you could come up from nowhere and make yourself. Of course, only if you're a man, and also a lot of those houses then completely disappeared because of things like this, that the changing dynamics of the economy. And he was really deluded, and he was a mean person ultimately. It's that sort of push people down and rebuild them in your own mold. So his second wife, Lucrezia, was that, women didn't have the option of challenging that. You just had to make it work. You just had to keep going. And I hope I've showed that a bit in her character, in the dynamic with Luna and her sister, who was, the one who was beautiful and was set up to be married to make family connections, great connections for the family and bring wealth to the family. And ultimately it all fell on Vincenzio's head, and ultimately, he got his comeuppance.
Certainly did.
I mean, you know what? I always think the Shanghai Wife, also one of the underpinning themes of that book, was the father-daughter relationship. So I think, as I write historical fiction, but you can't help but have some of your own experiences. That's all imbued into the book. And so I think I'm always looking at that relationship because of the relationship I had with my father, and my poor mum, who's wonderful and is my biggest supporter. I was thinking, I've got to write a book that's really about the mother, but actually that's because I have, the relationship that challenged me was the one with my father, and the one that I'm still trying to work out. He passed away 8 years ago now, but I'm still trying to work it out. Like it all still sits in me, and it never leaves you. I'm fascinated by that. And I think, yeah, that's what comes through in my stories, is that I'm really always drawing on my own relationship in that sense when it comes to the father-daughter dynamics in these books, which is not something I did on purpose. Like, I only realized that after I've written it, and I think, gosh, Emma, wow, that really is something that's still dwelling in your head somewhere.
Yeah, that was a dynamic that I found very interesting in this book. And I think that it really confused Luna, to be treated almost like an equal by her father, and to be indulged so, and for her intellect to be on display, and for her father to be so proud of her intellect early on in her life. But that very same intellect was used against her later on. It was such a slap in the face for her.
I know. It's like, I want you to be intelligent. I want you to have these opportunities, but only, your fundamental purpose and your future lies in being a wife. And everything that gives me back as the head of this family. Yeah, that's really confusing. And I think, that's something that still happens a lot today to women. It's like you still, there's a sense that our value is in being mothers and wives. And that just eradicates everything else that there is.
We do have value as mothers and wives, but it's not our only value.
No, you're absolutely right. We do. And I have, I'm a mother and I love that role, and my kids are my world. There's a lot more to me, and there's a lot more to all of us. And certainly in that time it was even less open. And sadly for Luna, thinking that at least she had a way out because she did have this malformed foot, ends up not working for her anyway, because of course the idea that, her father thinks that his name and is enough to find a good marriage for her, despite her flaws. But in actual fact, the brutality of that time was that, no, it wasn't going to be enough. Yeah. And so she's cast in the same light as every other young girl who has to marry or go to a convent.
Emma, you might know that there are a lot of writers that listen to this podcast, and given all of your experiences to date, your 2 beautiful novels, do you have any tips for writers out there?
You know what? It still feels like such a privilege to be asked that question, because I still feel like I'm learning, and I am one of the people listening to these podcasts as well, looking for all those gems of information and knowledge and writing them down to remind myself when you sit in front of the blank page, that you have to keep going. I think it absolutely is the case that you have to turn up to the page, take a deep breath, and write, and continue to write on a regular basis, because it's like any muscle. It will get better the more you do it, easier to do the more you do it. And then editing. I think one of the mistakes I made in my early days was thinking I'd written a wonderful novel after a first draft, after a second and third draft, thinking, yep, it's done. And it's only actually after having written the second book, and I know there's still so much more that I still have to learn about my own process, because that is something that is unique to each of us. But is that the editing is where you can really find the gems in your writing. And there's a moment that happens for me when I go back, and I continue to go back, and it might be as much as 3/4 of the way through the book, and I'll just decide I'm going to go back to that very first chapter and go through it all over again. And another sweep will offer up more, opportunities and words that I can see that there are better options for. And that was a really wonderful moment for me, actually, particularly in that first chapter, which is set, so many years before the rest of the book. It felt almost like it was like a little short story. And I think that's probably a tip, is not looking at the enormity of a 100,000-word novel, looking at chapters as short stories, because every chapter has to have, a hook at the end. Every chapter has to enthrall the reader and want them to go to the next chapter, offer up some information. Everything has to serve a purpose. And thinking as a finite little, not little, but, a finite number of pages, as opposed to a chapter within this huge book, makes it more manageable. Certainly made me feel like I could sort of tie it up with a bow in a way, which sounds silly because nothing is ever finished. And yet just dealing with it by chapter made it more accessible, and sort of allowed me to give myself the time to work on each of those chapters. And you build up a sense of yourself as a writer, and a belief in yourself. And I think you need that. You need to have a really fundamental sense of this is where you're supposed to be. And everyone will find something in themselves as a writer, if that's where you choose to be, and write what you love, because you want to have fun, and you want to be able to sit down every day with the page and be excited by it.
Emma, are you working on something else at the moment?
I am. I'm really excited because I've recently re-signed for another 2 books.
Yay.
HQ through HarperCollins with wonderful Joe Mackay, my publisher, who's a great supporter. I'm working on my 3rd book, which is also historical and is going to be set in Australia. It's a colonial story in the early 1800s about a group of women who came out from Woolwich on a ship to Van Diemen's Land. And I'm so excited about that. I'm thrilled that there is just so much material available. I think coming into the earlier centuries, closer centuries, has made the research, there's so much there. It's actually going to be harder because I've got so much to deal with, like real life stories of the people. But I'm loving it. Yes, it's going to be an Australian focused story, and it'll be out in 2024. 4, I believe. Actually, I'm not sure about that, but yeah.
Watch
And then
this
on to the
space.
next one as well.
Indeed, that's wonderful news. Emma, if listeners wanted to learn more about you and your books, where can they do that?
The best place is to follow me on Instagram, Emma Harcourt Author, and on Facebook, Emma Harcourt Author page, and also Emma Harcourt, I'm there. So social media, I find these days, is really where I spend my time. I think my website is really out of date. So I'm not even going to mention it. I'm mortified to say that. So I'm going to say, follow me on social media. And I will say hello back, because I'm just so thrilled to have people wanting to engage with my books, and just engage about books as well is so much fun.
Brilliant. Emma, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed The Brightest Star. It was an utterly brilliant read, and thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, Claudine, it's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you to all your listeners. I just feel honoured to be given the opportunity to talk about my books.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.